It's good to sleep in the middle of the night, because you're really
You've been here this whole time. Face an interesting color.
Stephen was against the wall.
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
Scarring without fighting. Exactly.
All right, there was good morning. Let's begin. So we left off, today's daf is Yud Aleph. We left off on Yud Amud Beis, the Mishnah. So we'll say another interesting set of Mishnayos today. Ha'omer l'chulin she'ochelecha. So we'll say if a person says l'chulin she'ochelecha. Now let's take a look over here at the Ran. So in the first round of the Mishnah, l'chulin she'ochelecha l'kasher l'dachi. See, it's kulu. The Rashi writes kulu bepasachos halamid karina lahu. Now both say now. So says the Ran. All of these are to be read with a patach under the lamid. So in other words, it's not lechulin, but rather it's la chulin. Or more specifically, we're going to see umishum hachi asar dimishtoi lo chulin ela karban. So we'll say. So says the Rash. What this Mishnah means to say is like this: Ha'omer lechulin, which really means lo chulin sha'ochalacha, which Rabbosai means that which I eat of yours is not chulin for me. I will say, now what does that mean? If it's not chulin for me, then what is it? Then by definition it's hekdish. Then by definition it's consecrated. So lo chulin sha'ochalacha, what I eat from you is not chulin, but rather again it's consecrated, is again a lashon of neder. Similarly, lo kosher, lo kosher sha'ochalacha, that which I eat of yours is not kosher, which again indicates to us. So remember, if that which I eat of yours is not kosher, which is another way of saying it's asur to me. Below dachi, that which I eat of yours is not clean to me. Tahar, I must say tahar would be the same thing. Lo tahar, that which I eat of yours is not tahar to me, i.e. is prohibited to me. Vitame, or that which I eat of yours is tame. In other words, again, prohibited to me. Nosar upigul, or that which I eat of yours is nosar, or that which I eat of yours is pigul. Both say, remember again, nosar means if you have a particular carbon, and the carbon has a particular, a limited window of consumption. After that window of consumption has ended, that carbon becomes pigul. Pigul is called the leftover. That's nosar. Pigul, however, again, is when the Kohen is doing the avodah, if he has an erroneous machshava, that renders the carbon unfit, totally disqualifies the carbon. So in all of these cases, Rabbi say, if you went ahead and you used any of these lashonos, so you've prohibited the item. Now let's take a look at the Ran just for one moment again. He says, Kulu b'pasos halami karina lahu umishum hachi aser dimishtoi lo chulin ela karban lo kasher ela aser lo dachi ela aser the ashkechan gabe heter kidaminon. Hey Yosef ben Yoezer, skip down a little bit. He says hilchach ki amar lo kasher velo dachi ela aser kamar the chitema ela aser mishum iser kamar velo mishum neder v'havile kimatfis b'davar ha'aser. Now both say what the Ran says, what the Gemara is introducing us to us over here is the concept of hatfasa. Hatfasa means that when you have something that is prohibited and you take something that is permitted and you're matfus, in other words, you attach it to something that is prohibited, of course, not literally attach it, but more conceptually attach it, so that gives the permitted item the status of the prohibited item. So for example, if I go ahead and I say, I say lo lechulin, right? Lo lechulin. Your stuff should not be like chulin to me, i.e. it should be like a carbon. What I'm doing is I'm attaching the item, your items, to a carbon. I'm being matvises. Or for example, nosar. I say your stuff should be like nosar to me. Nosar is prohibited. We'll get into this more a little bit later on. Nosar is prohibited. I'm attaching your items, so to speak, to nosar. So therefore, again, your items become asr to me. This is all the concept of hatfasa. So he goes on. Ki'imra, first wide line in the Mishnah. Ki'imra, similarly, if a person says that, interesting enough, that I say your object should be like a sheep to me. And I'm saying if you take a look at the Ran, the say in this case over here, the Ran is on Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. So the Ran, take a look at the Ran. It's actually all the way down on Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Ki'imra, you see that? Ki'imra. So the Ran says kiseh shel karban. So if a person says that this I say to Ruvain, your stuff should be ki'imra, like a sheep. So we assume that what does it mean if I say your item should be like a sheep to me? That means like a sheep of a carbon. That I'm assuming that what I'm saying is your items, your objects should be like sacrificial items to me. Distam nedarim lahachmir va'od demashma deseh hayadua kamar. So we'll say again, if I say your object should be like a sheep to me, the assumption is I'm talking about a sacrificial sheep. Similarly, if we go ahead and we say kidirim, kidirim. So we'll say kidirim. A deer is like a pen. So if I say your object should be to me like a deer, like a pen. So again, the Ran says on Yud Aleph from the Aleph, ki karbano shebedirim. That means I'm making your object like sacrificial animals that are in the pen. Remember, there was a pen by the Beis Hamikdash compound in which they would keep animals that could be sold for sacrificial purposes. Therefore, I'm saying that animals should be like a sacrifice. Ke'etzim. If I say your object should be like wood onto me, so what does eitzim mean? So again, the Ran says ke'eitzim kishnei gizrei eitzim shaya orech al gabi ma'aracha. This refers to the wood that was on the mizbeach. Ki'ishim, I say your stuff should be like fire onto me. The assumption again is that refers to the fire of the mizbeach. Kimizbeach, if I say your object should be like the mizbeach onto me, or kehechal, your object should be like the heichal of the Beis Hamikdash onto me, or Yerushalayim, or again I say your object should be like Yerushalayim onto me. Nadar be'echad nekom mishamshi hamizbeach, or for that matter, I made a neder using one of the utensils of the mizbeach. So I say, your property should be like the kaf, should be like the ladle onto me. Remember, the kaf was used for the ketores. So it should be like the ladle onto me. So what's the halacha? Afapi shelo hiskir karban. So we're saying all of these cases, even though there was no explicit mention of carbon, hare ze nadar becarbon. In all of these situations, I both say this is considered as if a person made a neder b'hatfasa by linking the prohibited item with some type of sacrificial item. So we're saying all of these cases, these words by themselves are innocuous, but when stated in the context of a neder, are assumed to refer to some type of sacrificial aspect, and therefore if I say, your property should be to me like a sheep, like a pen, like wood, like fire, like the mizbeach, like the heichal, like Yerushalayim, or like one of the utensils of the mizbeach, it's hatfasa, I'm linking your object with one of the items, with a carbonic type of item, and therefore again it creates a chaloshin neder.
And then what?
And then it's usher to me. Then it's usher. Just like a carbon or any of these items are technically usher to me. Therefore, remember again, I will say the whole point of here is I'm trying to create a prohibition upon myself to your property. I want to take a neder against using your property. So the verbiage I'm using over here are these. Instead of saying harei like carbon, I'm using one of these other words. The chiddush of the Mishnah is these words essentially link. These words are each linked to karbanos in their own distinct way. And therefore, if I make a neder using one of these terminologies, your property becomes prohibited upon me. Rabbi Huda says, "Ha'omer Yerushalayim lo amar klum." On the other hand, Rabbi Huda says, if you just say Yerushalayim, you just say your property is Yerushalayim to me, then that is a meaningless statement. And the Ran again comments, he says, Om Yerushalayim amar klum mishum de lo amar ki Yerushalayim. So in the previous part of the Mishnah, if you remember again, he said ki Yerushalayim. If I say your property should be like Yerushalayim to me, that is a meaningful statement because I'm actively linking your property to Yerushalayim. But which again, and the assumption over there is I'm linking it to the Kiddush of Yerushalayim or to the Kiddusha of the Beis Hamikdash. But again, if I just say Yerushalayim, then that by definition again is a meaningless statement. Top of Yud Aleph. Savruha, my lechulin. So the Gemara understands. So what does it mean lechulin? Lo lechulin lehabi ela karbam. So what the Mishnah means, and this we saw on the Ran already, that lechulin really means is a contraction. Lechulin means lo lechulin. Your property should not be chulin onto me. Rather, it should be a karbam. So Mani Masnisin, whose opinion does our Mishnah reflect? Rabbi Meir, if you want to say it's Rabbi Meir, les le michlal lav ata shomeahin. I will say now, we will see, the Gemara is going to teach us in just a moment, that there's an interesting discussion in general when it comes to a Tanai, or any type of we'll call it binding statements. That we know that the paradigm for, let's say, a Tanai, for a condition, is Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain, that when Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain want to stay in the Ever Yarden, they want to stay in the Transjordanian lands, Moshe Rabbeinu says no problem, but you have to go ahead and fight for Klal Yisrael, and you have to go ahead and help them get settled in the land. So what happened? So Moshe Rabbeinu phrases it in the positive and the negative. So Moshe Rabbeinu goes in and says, if you fight for Klal Yisrael, then you'll be able to settle the land. But if you don't fight for Klal Yisrael, you will not settle the land. Now, the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu had to phrase it in both the positive and the negative indicates to us that anytime you want to create a binding condition, it must be phrased in the positive or the negative. Now, the truth is that's the source of dispute. Not everybody agrees with that. So watch this. So the Gemara says like this. So you're telling me now, if I go ahead and I say to Reuven, lo lechulin nechasech, right? Your property is not chulin onto me. So we're saying, so what does that really mean? That your property is not chulin to me, rather, what is your property? Your property is kodesh onto me. In other words, I can't get any benefit from it. So the Gemara says, well, whose opinion is reflected in this Mishnah? Can't be Rabbi Meir. Why? Because Rabbi Meir does not hold that you could infer a negative from a positive, or a positive from a negative. This nan, Rabbi Meir says, kol t'nai she'enu k't'nai b'nei Gad b'nei Ruvain, because Rabbi Meir says any condition that is not like the condition of Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain, i.e., it doesn't explicitly state the positive and the negative, Eno Tanai is not the proper Tanai. So therefore, again, I will say the fact that the Mishnah is saying that I could infer that something is kodesh, something is consecrated, and therefore, when I say consecrated, you understand, something is prohibited to me from the lashon of lo chulin, right? It's not chulin, and therefore I'm referring from that, but it is kodesh onto me. That inference cannot be made according to Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir does not hold that when it comes to binding statements that we can infer anything. According to Rabbi Meir, in order for a statement to be binding, what has to happen? It has to be explicit. So rather, El Rabbi Hudi, it must be Rabbi Huda. But here's the problem, because apparently, again, by Tanai Rabbosai, Rabbi Huda holds that you do not need lav and hein. Rabbi Huda holds that Lamaisi, you could just, all you need to do is articulate one side of the Tanai, and the other side is immediately understood. So the Gemara says, Ema Sefer, but so must be Rabbi Yehuda. So Ema Sefer, here's the problem. If you look at the end of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, HaOmer Yerushalayim lo Omer Klum. Rabbi Yehuda said that if you just make the statement, your property is like Yerushalayim to me, that you have not said anything. Now, Bosai says the Gemara, may the Sefer Rabbi Yehuda, Reish Alav Rabbi Yehudahi. Now, in general, there's a stylistic idea that if somebody is quoted by name in one part of the Mishnah, that means that part of the Mishnah which they are quoted is their opinion, but the previous part of the Mishnah that they were not quoted in is not their opinion. So therefore, you want to tell me now that the beginning of the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, but here's the problem. The end of the Mishnah quotes Rabbi Yehuda as saying that if you said Yerushalayim, you didn't say anything. Now, if the end of the Mishnah is quoting Rabbi Yehuda, but Pashtus, what that means is that the beginning of the Mishnah is not Rabbi Yehuda. To which the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Kula Rabbi Yehudahi. In fact, the entire Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. V'achikatani. This is how the Mishnah should read. Shet Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Ha'omer Yerushalayim lo Omer Klum. So I'll say, it's amazing what a little shin does, right? So the Gemara says, no, you have to read it like this. The first part of the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion, I will say, that's what? When making a tonight, when making a condition, you do not need to phrase the condition with both the positive and the negative. Rather, reciting the condition even in just one direction is absolutely fine. Therefore, again, if a person says lo chulin or lo lechulin, that is a binding neder. And at the end of the Mishnah, it says shet Rabbi Yehuda hayom, because Rabbi Yehuda used to say, so when you add in that little shin, what does that do? That says a continuation. That Rabbi Yehuda used to say that Rabbi Yehuda used to say that if you just say Yerushalayim, that statement by itself is meaningless. And therefore, again, in fact, the entire Mishnah could reflect the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Now, let's analyze this. When you say Ki Yerushalayim, that literally I say to Reuven, your property should be like Yerushalayim to me. Is that true? Is that true that now that statement creates a binding neder, creates an isser? V'hatanya, but we learned, Rabbi Yehuda says, Ha'omer ki Yerushalayim lo amar klum. But Rabbi Yehuda said that if a person says ki Yerushalayim, a person has not made a meaningful statement. Ad sheyidar bedavar hakari b'Yerushalayim. Until what? The only time you can make a binding neder is harabosai, is if you go ahead and you matfis your neder, you attach your neder to something that is offered in Yerushalayim. If you look at Rashi says, Ad sheyidar bedavar hakari b'Yerushalayim, kigon karbanos umenachos shekreven legabe mizbeach. So we'll say here you have the Bryce that says what? That Rabbi Yehuda says, if you just go ahead and say, Ruvain, your property should be to me like Yerushalayim, that is a meaningless statement. Why? Because we'll say Hatfasa only works. See, we'll say what we're going to see, what's going to come out from here is something very interesting. So remember, we're dealing now with the concept of Hatfasa. Hatfasa means that there's a new way to make a neder. What's the new way to make a neder? If you link your neder to something that is usher already. But I will say, now here's the chap. That only works if the item to which you are linking it to also becomes usher through some type of vow or promise situation. So for example, if I go ahead, that's why if I say Hare alai karban, right? Or I should say it differently. If I say that Reuben, your property should be to me like a karban. So that's like a more explicit statement. So there, how does an object become a karban? It's designated, right? A person makes a statement that creates a chalos shem, that creates a reality. So just like the karban is saying that is created through my dibur, through my speech, through my own actions. So what I'm saying is now I'd like to create a new reality based on my actions as well, just like that one. So meaning hatfasa works when you link two common items, not the same item, but two common in the sense of a halachic process. That just like the carbon was made usher through designation and through a verbal appointment, so too again I'm making this item now usher in the same way. That's hatfasa. As we're going to see.
Carbon, it doesn't work for a kosher trait though.
I'm sorry. So good. We're going to see that. We're going to see why that. We're going to talk about those lashonos. So now, what the Gemara is saying is like this. If you just go ahead and you say Ki Yerushalayim, so what have I really said, Rabbi? So Rabbi Huda says that Lamaisa, the way this is going to work is how. So Rabbi Huda says, therefore, if you just say Ki Yerushalayim, like Yerushalayim, that is not that's a meaningless statement. Now, now here's the problem. If Rabbi Huda is saying that Ki Yerushalayim is a meaningless statement, then what? Then at the end of the day, he can't be the author of the Mishnah. Because the Mishnah said that Ki Yerushalayim, if I say to Ruvain, your property should be to me like Yerushalayim, that Lamaisa again, that is a proper statement, to which the Gemara says, So Gemara Yehuda holds that you only create hatfasa if you link the object that you are vowing about to something that is offered in Yerushalayim, i.e. to a karban, to which the Gemara answers, Kula Rabbi Yehudahi. In reality, again, all of this, the entire thing is Rabbi Yehuda. Utrei Tanoi alibid Rabbi Yehuda. Both says, to which the Gemara answers, it's a machlokes Tanoim about what Rabbi Yehuda himself actually said. Before you turn the page, Rabbi say, look at the last Ran on the page. So the Ran says, Trei Tanoi alibid Rabbi Yehuda. There are two different Tanaim according to Rabbi Yehuda. So he writes, Tana demas nisin savar de Rabbi Yehuda daito al davar hakar b'Yushalayim. So Rabbi say, the Tana of our Mishnah, the opinion of our Mishnah, or I should say, the opinion in Rabbi Yehuda of our Mishnah holds that when a person makes any of these, person utters any of these lashonos, his intent is regarding something that is offered in Yerushalayim, i.e. karbanos, and therefore v'chi amar ki Yerushalayim missar, and therefore Rabbi say, if I say to Ruvain, your property, your object should be like Yerushalayim unto me, I'm not really comparing the item to Yerushalayim. What am I comparing the item to? I'm actually comparing it to karbanos that are offered in Yerushalayim. However, again, Tana Bira, but the second Tana, which was the Tana of the Brisa we just quoted, Savar dedaito al itzim va'avanim. That literally, again, that when I say Ki Yerushalayim, so what's my intent? My intent is to talk about and to think about the actual dirt and stones of Yerushalayim, and therefore, again, such a neder will be ineffective. Va'ad sheyidar bedavar hakarav lo misar, and until you link this item now to something that is offered, indeed, the neder will not take effect. So I'll say there's a fundamental dispute in Rabbi Yehuda about how to view the vow of the item should be like Yerushalayim. Tana of our Mishnah says that when you say like Yerushalayim, that means like the karbanos that are offered in Yerushalayim, and the Tana of the Brisa holds that like Yerushalayim means the actual dirt and stones of Yerushalayim, which of course, although it's a beautiful, beautiful speech, nevertheless, again, it's not going to create any kind of neder like Isser. Amud Beis, Tanya. Okay. Tanya. Chulin, hachulin, kichulin. So we'll say, if a person made the following statements, a person said, remember this is all we'll say in the context of neder. So I'm taking a neder, prohibiting Ruvain's items upon myself, and I say, chulin, hachulin, kichulin. Your property should be chulin. Chulin means, remember, mundane, unconsecrated items. Hachulin, kichulin, bein she'ochel lecha, bein shelo ochel lecha, bless you, mutter. Ultimately, it's mutter. So whether I say chulin achulin kechulin, whether I say that I will eat of yours or that I won't eat of yours, such a neder is not binding. Take a look at the Ran Rabbos for just a moment. What's the case over here? Tanya chulin hachulin kechulin bein she'ochel lecha, bein shelo ochel lecha mutter. Bisha ochel lecha pshita deshari. So we'll say, listen to this. If I say that chulin should be the items that I eat of yours, so I will say, of course, that's not a neder, because all I'm doing is what? Is affirming the fact that your stuff is not consecrated to me. Ubishalo ochel lecha. But we'll say, let's say I say like this, right? The stuff, your items that I will not eat of yours, or I should say, your food that I will not eat of is chulin to me, right? Is chulin to me. Or right right. Your food that I will not eat of is chulin to me. So the Ran says, lo yehe chulin. So we'll say, if I make this statement that which I eat of yours should be chulin, or that which I don't eat of yours should be chulin. Right? This is chulin hachulin kechulin. Right? That which I eat of yours should be chulin. So we'll say, so the assumption therefore is that maybe I can infer from that, and that which I don't eat of yours should be like hekdish. So the Gemara is saying over here that such a neder does not work. Why? Because the Gemara is saying we passing Rabbi Meir that michlal lav einat hashameahin. We do not infer the negative from positive. So if you're just making a statement that a stuff should be like chulin, we don't infer anything from that particular statement. Therefore, such a neder is not binding at all. However, l'chulin she'ochel lecha, l'chulin she'ochel lecha. But listen to this: if I say l'chulin or lo chulin she'ochel lecha, that literally it will not be chulin that which I eat of yours, then that will be asur. So both say, remember, sounds like the case we had in our Mishnah. That lo chulin she'ochel lecha, it's that which I eat of yours will not be chulin, which again sounds like we infer from here, but rather it should be hekdish. Now take a look at the Ran again. So the Ran says over here, he says, Kachi kagir sabarov hanuschos, v'kash yatuva, lama aser, v'hami shumichlalav atashomeh tzrichen lemesiba, el Rabbi Meir lesle, v'chitem alo tzrichen b'hala michlalav, kevan da amar lo chulin al karchach karban habi lesa, d'hami shum hachi ukimna le'almas, isen del Rabbi Meir, alma afilu b'chi ha, so we'll say, remember, the first thing the Ran says is, one second, you just got finished saying that we don't infer, right? That in order for statements to be binding, they have to be explicit. When you say, lo l'chulin sha'ochel lecha, that which I eat of yours will not be chulin. So and you say that's a binding neder. The reason that's a binding neder is why? Because you're inferring that when you say not for chulin, what does that mean? That means, but it will be hektish. But you just told me before that we don't infer like Rabbi Meir, and we set up the entire Mishnah reflecting the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Lefichach yesh mi she'omer delo garsina lehacha klal. So first of all, the Ran says there are some who take out this statement that we just read altogether from the Gemara. It doesn't seem to fit over here at all. And therefore he says, Va'achirim amru l'kaima girsa b'shem ha'rayvitzal, dilachulin garsa, dilachalin garsinon, below vav. We'll say this is interesting. So the Ran says, so there are two different girsos. Some remove this statement altogether from the Gemara over here, this whole phrase, that l'chulin sha'ochel aser, some just remove it from here, because it doesn't seem to be part of this discussion. Others take out the vav. And it doesn't say l'chulin, but rather what does it say? L'chalin. Now, what does that mean, l'chalin? He says, mishum hachi kamissar de bechalos toda ka'amar. Oh, I will say, if I say l'chalin she'ochel lecha, that which I eat of yours should be like the chalos, should be like the loaves. Where does that refer to? Loaves of what? Lachmei toda. Lachmei toda. And therefore, again, that actually is, out of all the cases we've seen today, that's actually one of the easiest. Why? Because that's explicit. Right? So if I say that your property should be like the Lachmei toda to me, I'm explicitly saying that your property should be like sacrificial items to me, and therefore, again, l'maiset will be aser. So the Gemara goes weiter. Lo chulin lo ochel lecha, mutter. So, however, again, if he says that lo chulin lo ochel lecha, then it's mutter. So the Gemara says, look at the Ran again. Lo chulin lo ochel lecha mutter. Bein vav, bein lo vav, asi shapir kimosh nefarish besamoch. So I'll say, so now we're going to see that this lechulin is literally again lechulin, not lechalin. Will be mutter. Why? Reish Shamani, Rabbi Meir. The lesle michlalav ata shomeahem. The boss says, remember again, the Reisha is Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir is the one who holds that we do not infer the negative from positive. Take Gemara says, well, 1 second. Ema Seifa, look at the end of the Mishnah. L'chulin la'ochalacha mutter. That remember again, if he says l'chulin la'ochalacha, that it will be mutter. That it will be mutter. V'hatzna, but we learned l'karban la'ochalacha. Then we'll say if a person says l'chulin la'ochalacha, excuse me, the karban la'ochalacha, that this item will be a karban, or I should say, for carbonic purposes, I will not eat of your stuff, or for carbon, I will not eat of yours. Rabbi Meir Oser. Both say in that case, Rabbi Meir says that it's Oser. So the Gemara says the Kashilan. But how could Rabbi Meir hold that it's Oser? Both say you see what's happening over here. According to Rabbi Meir, see, remember on Amud Aleph, the reason why the Gemara chose to set up the Mishnah like Rabbi Huda was why? Because the Mishnah was giving me a couple of different phrases that I had to infer from. So, for example, where the Mishnah told me that Ha'omer lo chulin she'ochelecha. If I say lo chulin she'ochelecha, I will not that which I eat of yours will not be chulin. So the Mishnah ruled that is a valid neder. So the only way you can say that's a valid neder is how? If you infer. If you say michlal lav atashameyahin, if you say that when you make a positive statement or a negative statement, either way, that you could infer something from that, that's the only way that neder works. So if I say lo lechulin shochalacha, that which I eat of yours will not be chulin. So if I have the license to infer from that and say, oh, what that means is it won't be chulin, but it will be karban, that creates a binding neder. So the only way that works is if you set up the Mishnah not like Rabbi Meir. Because Rabbi Meir holds that we do not say Michlal Lavat Hashamein. According to Rabbi Meir, in order for any type of verbiage, whether for any statement, whether it's a neder, whether it's a tonight to be binding, it must be explicit. Therefore, we have to set up the Mishnah like Rabbi Huda, who holds that even non-explicit and inferred statements can be binding. Now, what the Gemara is saying over here is quoting another kasha, and now you hear Rabbi Meir on record saying that if a person says la karban, right, lo le karban la ochalacha, literally that which I do not eat of yours will not be a karban. So I'll say, so what's the inference from that statement? That which I will not eat of yours will not be a karban. What do you infer from that? That which I do eat of yours will what? Will be a karban. And Rabbi Meir says that such a statement works. I will say now why somebody would actually phrase a neder this way, as opposed to just saying it is irrelevant. Remember again, our Gemara is filled with cases of situations where you scratch it wondering why would this ever happen. Remember, so Gemara always uses exaggerated cases in order to make a point. That's the style, that's by design of the Gemara. So therefore, again, so Rabbi Meir is on record as now saying that lo lekarban lo ochalacha. If I go ahead and I say this will not be a carbon, that which I will not eat of yours will not be a carbon. Rabbi Meir is on record as saying that lemaisa it works. So the Gemara says v'kashilan. How could that be? Ha lesle michlal lav atashomeahin. But how could that be? Because remember, we do not infer positive statements from that which is negative. We can't infer anything. So as Rameir say that it's motor, you see that it's aser. I'm sorry?
When we say the Reisha is Rameir, we're referring to Reisha in the Brisa?
Reisha in the Brisa right now. So the Gemara says the following, but Amar Rabbi Abba, Na'aseh ke'omer, listen to this, Na'aseh ke'omer, lekarban yehei, lefichach lo'ochelecha. No, the way Rabbi Meir understands that statement, Rabbi say is what? That he's saying lekarban yehei. That when it's interesting. The way Rabbi Meir understands the phrase of lekarban lo ochalacha, he turns it around. That what that actually means is lekarban yehei lefichach lo ochalacha. It will be like a karban, and therefore again I may not eat any of your food. Hachanami. So the Gemara says hachanami hachi kamerli. This is what it means to say over here as well. Lo lechulin lehavi. It will not be like chulin, rather it will be like a karban, and therefore I may not go ahead and eat of your stuff. So the Gemara says lefichal lo ochalacha. Excuse me, the chulin lehavi will be like it's lo lechulin lehavi will not be like chulin, rather it will be like a karban. Therefore lefichach lo ochalacha. Therefore again I will not eat of yours. To which the Gemara says, Hai tana sor Rabbi Meir bechada, upalagali bechada. So both say, remember now we're confused as to the authorship of the Brisa, because both say we seem to be saying now it's like Rabbi Meir, but yet again there are other pieces that contradict that assertion. To which the Gemara finally says, the truth is the Tana holds like Rabbi Meir in one case, and argues on him in a second case. Savar lekava say bechada. He holds like Rabbi Meir in one case. The less they michlal lav ata shomei ahein. So he holds like Rabbi Meir in that what? In that lemaisa. In that lemaisa, we hold michlal lav ata shomei ahein. That we don't hold michlal lav ata shomei ahein. That you can't infer anything. So he holds like Rabbi Meir in that in order for any type of statement to be binding, it must be explicit and it cannot rely on any type of inferences. But yet the Tana argues in Rabbi Meir in what case? Bikarban. In the case of, I'll say, ultimately in karban. In the case of lo lekarban, right? She'ini ochalachas. He argues on him in the case where Rabbi Meir will say, therefore, lo karban lo ochalacha, right? That Rabbi Meir will say that case does not work because it's not explicit, whereas the Tana will say that case does work because the Tana understands that lo karban she'ini ochalacha actually means that lo karban she'ani ochalacha. That when essentially you have this double negative, that you could you don't have to infer anything, but rather you could reinterpret that phrase in the positive. So if I say lo lekarban she'eni ochalacha, it will not be a carbon that which I do not eat of yours. So Rabbi Meir says, well, that's a non-explicit statement, so therefore it's not going to work. And the Tana will say, no, it will work. How will it work? Because it's a double negative. Because it's a double negative, you could interpret it as the positive, saying what? That it will be for a carbon that which I will eat of yours. In other words, that anything that I would eat of yours is carbonically prohibited to me, and therefore creates a binding carbon. But I'll just show you on the side. Actually, let's do that. Rav Ashi says, Had Amar Lachulin. Rav Ashi says over here that what's the case where you're saying lichulin, the had amar lo lichulin, the mashma lo lihavi lichulin ela carbon. Rav Ashi says everything depends on the type of wording you use. It's interesting. If you say, it's amazing how one type of one vowel can make a difference. If you say lichulin, so lichulin sha'ani ochalacha is a meaningless statement. Why? Because what is lichulin sha'ani ochalacha? How does that translate? Your property will be chulin to me. Your food will be chulin. Okay? It's no different than it is right now. But if you say lo chulin she'ochalacha, so lo chulin means what? Lo lechulin shani ochalacha. That which I eat of yours will not be chulin, rather will what? Will be consecrated. I will say it's an incredible musar, how one little vowel can make such a fun, how much you have to be careful with your speech, because how one little vowel can make such a fundamental difference. Lechulin, meaningless statement. Lo lechulin, or I should say, lo chulin, means not for chulin shall be your property, i.e. shall be carbon, and ultimately again becomes a binding carbon. But so just before we go on, take a quick look at the Ran. You see in the Ran, in the wide lines, about 5 lines in the middle of the line, it says, Ule inyan halacha. You see that? So first of all, the Ran is a very important Ran. He says, Ule inyan halacha, naktinan Rabbi Yehuda, de islay, michlal lav atar shomeahin. We paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that in fact you can infer, that you are allowed to infer when it comes to statements, and specifically that michlal lav atar shomeahin, from negative statements you are permitted to infer positive statements, and vice versa. Ukistam masdisin dahacha afagav darim sha'achsu the askin shmo begita the shlimira imesi vim lo mesi b'tnai kafel lam b'shul shalik Rabbi Meir el dechash leil revacha demilsa. So we'll say, now I wanted to point something out over here. There are instances in halacha where we hold that you need a t'nai kafel, right? This double t'nai, positive and the negative. But what the Ran is pointing out over here, that's not because that we really pass that you need a t'nai kafel. Rather, sometimes Chazal will mandate a t'nai kafel. Remember, t'nai kafel means a double t'nai, both in positive and negative, in order to avoid confusion in certain cases. But the Ran says, in the purest form of halacha, we do not pass like Rabbi Meir, we pass like Rabbi Yehuda. Therefore, we do infer positive from negative and negative from positive in certain statements. I will say that's clear. Why is that clear? Because the Mishnah explicitly says that we do. Remember again, the phrase of lo chulin creates a binding neder. Why does it create a binding neder? Because lemaisa, again, we interpret lo chulin as lo lechulin, and we interpret multiple other phrases also it's not chulin, but rather it's a carbon. So that's lav, that's a negative statement that we're interpreting into the positive, that it should be for a carbon, meaning positive creates a prohibition, but it's phrased in the positive. So therefore the Ran says, we pass in like Rabbi Yehuda, and we say mechlal lav ata shameahein. There are times in halacha where you require a t'nai kafel, but the Ran says those are only in specific cases where Chazal looking to avoid confusion. So let's go a little bit back. Says the Gemara, Tar v'tamei v'nos Rabbi Galaser. So remember again, the Mishnah said, if I go ahead and say that your items should be lo tahor, not tahor, or they should be tameh, or they should be no surah pigel, all of these statements create a neder. So I say your property should not be tahor to me. So what does that mean? Rather, it should be tameh to me. Or if I say your property should be tameh to me, or when I say property, it doesn't have to be property. It can be your loaf of bread, whatever it is, doesn't matter. Or your loaf of bread should be tameh to me, or it should be no sir to me. All of these create a neder. Says the Gemara, Bayra in Barchama, Hare alai kibasar zivchei shlamim la'achar zvikas tamim mahu. So it says it's an interesting case. Rabbi Barchama asked the following kasha. So let's say I say to Ruvain, your loaf of bread should be to me like sacrificial meat after the sprinkling of the blood. Now I will say, now remember, so what happens after the sprinkling of the blood? The halacha is, the ikar part of a carbon is rikas damim, the sprinkling of the blood. Once sprinkling of the blood has been done, carbon mission has been accomplished. Now remember also, for example, in the case of a shlamim, so shlamim, for example, has meat that is consumed by the owners, by the kohanim, and on the mizbeach. And after the sprinkling of the blood is when I, the owner, am permitted to go ahead and eat the meat. This is an interesting shaila. So let's say I say to Ruvain, your loaf of bread should be to me like the sacrificial meat of shlamim after the sprinkling of the blood. So the Gemara says, Mahu, right? So what is the status of such a neder? Idika amar bahadein lishna, be'atera kamatis. Now I will say, now the truth is this is not a kasha, because if this is the lashon you're using, then what? There is no prohibition that is created. Why? Because the hatfasa, I am linking Ruvain's loaf of bread to what? To an item that is permitted, right? Because remember, the meat after the sprinkling of the blood is fundamentally permitted. So what's the case? Ella kigon demachis basar zivchei shlamim umachis te'atera gabe. So rather, we'll say, what do? I go ahead and I take the loaf of bread, right, Ruvain's loaf of bread, and I put it on top of, or I should say, it doesn't have to be that I place it, but let's say that I take the sacrificial meat and I put it next to umachis de'atera gabe, and I place it next to the loaf. Va'amar ze kazeh, and I say this one should be like this one. This is what Shabbos says. Again, remember, same case, it's the meat of the shlamim after the zrikas hadamim, and I place it next to the permitted loaf, and I say this one should be like this one. This loaf should be to me like this one. So what's the impact of that statement? Mai bi'ikara kamatvis o be'atera kamatvis. So we'll say here's the fundamental shaila. Am I saying that the loaf should be like the meat as it is now, and therefore if I'm linking it to the meat as it is now, then what's the status of the loaf? Permitted, right? Why? Because remember, this is sacrificial meat after the sprinkling of the blood, and I'm permitted to eat it. In which case, I have not created chalo shem isra. Or am I, when I say this one should be like this one, I'm linking the bread to what? To what the sacrificial meat was in its essence. What was it in its essence? It was carbonic meat, and therefore perhaps I'm linking it to the state of this meat prior to the zrikas hadamim. If I'm linking the loaf to the status of this meat prior to the sprinkling of the blood, what was the status of the meat prior to the sprinkling of the blood? It was usher, it was sacrificial meat, off limits to everyone. And therefore, perhaps I'm linking the loaf to that. So I will say that's the fundamental shaila. So if I say, remember, if I'm explicit and I say this loaf should be like the meat after the sprinkling of the blood, so that's very explicit, that's clear. I'm linking the loaf to something absolutely permitted. But if again I say zeh kazeh, this one should be like this one, the shaila is what state of meat am I referring to? Present state, in which case again the meat is permitted, loaf is permitted, or past state, in which the meat was prohibited from a sacrificial standpoint, and therefore the loaf is prohibited as well. I will say I'm going to leave off with this question. Amir Hashem, we will answer it tomorrow.